Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a brand new Ruy Lopez Masterclass. The video here today, along with the 9 videos that will follow in this series, will essentially teach you everything you need to know about playing the Ruy Lopez with the white side. And what that means, and I'll just quickly show it on the board, the Ruy Lopez begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and here we play bishop e5, and from this position onward, we're going to talk about everything that black could possibly throw at you, and by the end of this series, you should have a good understanding of how to respond, and that includes very specific theory that I'll show you, but also more general ideas and plans that you'll be able to employ. This is just going to be an introduction video to this masterclass, so we're going to go over some housekeeping items that are relevant to this course, and we're also going to touch base on each of the different videos and kind of very briefly look at what each will entail. And I think that this sort of orientation will be helpful to sort of map out all of the variations that we're going to look at. And I think, again, this will be helpful, especially for this Ruy Lopez masterclass, because this is just such a theory-heavy and theory-rich opening that I think if we jump too early in, it can feel a little intimidating and overwhelming, and I think it's helpful to just quickly look at each of the various options that black has, and then when you start learning them, they'll kind of fit into place a little bit better. So first thing to get out of the way is that each video will have a PGN file attached to it, and I think that is, again, especially important for the Ruy Lopez, with so much theory attached to it, that after each video, you can then put the PGN into ChessBase, Chessable, Lichess, Chess.com, whatever you'd like, and you can review the ideas and the lines at your own leisure. Now I'm going to move on to a little bit about the philosophy of why I've chosen this opening. So if you're not aware, I've made several opening masterclasses before, and all of them have been for the black side. So an opening repertoire for the white pieces was long overdue, but why did I choose the Ruy Lopez? Well, the simple answer is this opening is a fantastic choice for every player, for all levels. First of all, at the highest level of chess, there is a reason why this opening is seen at practically every tournament, and that is because it's the most reputable and it's the most ambitious. Objectively, when you turn on the engine likes this opening the most, and there's a reason why every world champion, for example, employed this opening to some extent. But even if we go all the way down, and this is rare, usually the highest openings are quite difficult to navigate at a lower level, but the beautiful thing about the Ruy Lopez is even if we go all the way down to a beginner level, every move we've made thus far and every move that we'll make in the future has a very clear purpose. It's a very principled opening. Let me tell you what I mean. The move e4, grab space in the center. What could be better? Then we develop the knight to its most active post on f3, and we do the same with the bishop on b5. We then look to castle, develop our other pieces, often with this very nice maneuver to activate it in its best potential. This is very easy to understand because we're following the principles, and additionally, on top of that, the positions that we tend to get tend to be very positionally rich. There's a lot of positional concepts that both sides need to be aware of, and it makes for a very good beginner opening because you get to be introduced to all sorts of different positional ideas, but on top of that, there is also a fair bit of tactical potential, especially primarily on the king side, and again, we'll see much of that in this masterclass. So for the fact that it's very principled, for the fact that you get to be introduced to a lot of tactical and positional motifs, I think this is a wonderful choice for beginners. And again, there's a reason why a lot of chess players recommend this opening for players who are just starting out. And of course, every rating in between also can benefit from the Ruy Lopez. So on one hand, the Ruy Lopez is incredible for all the reasons that I just mentioned. The positions we get tend to be incredibly rich, and the opening tends to be extremely principled. But the downside, on the other hand, is that there is so much theory. Because every world champion has played this, because this opening has been at the highest level, the most popular choice for so many generations, it means that there's so much developed theory attached to it. And what that means for new players or new learners of this opening is that there's this big barrier of entry. And so this masterclass, I wanted to do something about that. And so what I've made is a pretty serious decision. And that decision is that we're going to cut the theory that we have to learn tremendously. And so in the main line, which follows after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, we're not going to castle here. This is the main move. There are hundreds of thousands of games that have been reached this position here. And from here, black has a plethora of very reasonable choices, and each one has so much theory, so many games, so many lines attached to it. And it means that if you want to learn this opening and you want to play for these main lines, you're just going to have to invest months of study time before you get to actually play it. And I don't think that's practical, and I don't think that's fun. So what have I done? Well, what I've decided to do is to play in this position, instead of castles, the so-called Anderson with d3. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we get to that chapter. But I'll just show you that against the Berlin, instead of castling, which is the main move, we're also playing d3, the anti-Berlin. So there's a couple of reasons why I've made this decision to play d3 in these positions. First of all, there's great consistency between these two move orders of a6, knight f6, and d3, and the immediate knight f6, d3. And again, you'll see this in this masterclass. I'll very deeply and clearly talk about the transpositional value between this and the consistency between the two. But additionally, and a bit more to the point, aren't we sacrificing a lot by not going into the main lines? I mean, are we even playing the Ruy Lopez if we're not playing the main Ruy Lopez? My answer is yes. Now, why is that? Because after we play d3 in these lines, our next moves are c3, castles, rook e1, knight to d2 to f1 to g3, h3, and our main breaks that we're going for are d4 and a4. Now, here's the amazing thing. Everything that I've just said maps on and applies 100% to the traditional mainline Ruy Lopez. The same piece maneuver, the same pawn breaks, the same ideas of playing on the king side and the queen side. We're going to get the exact same type of game. Now, why is the main line then if we can just cut the theory so much by playing this? Well, there is one downside to the way that I'm recommending we play this, which is that in the main line, like I said, one of the key ideas for white is to get in this d4 break. And so by not putting the pawn on d3, they can play d4 in one move and save a tempo. The way that we're going to play this in this masterclass is we're going to instead play d3 and later play c3, and in around 10 moves or so, hope to play d4. Now, this does mean the downside of my recommendation is that we're going to then waste the tempo in theory by playing d3 first and then d4. But I think that that is well worth the amount of theory that we are saving ourselves. And again, because we are getting fairly maneuvering positions, fairly positional positions, I think it is fair to waste the tempo to cut down the theory, because Black cannot take advantage of that very easily. There are some openings where if you give your opponent an extra tempo, it's over. The Ruy Lopez is not that opening. Again, it's a very slow maneuvering game. And so if we waste a mover here or there, and we're going to only do it here, it's not the end of the world. And again, and by the way, the engine totally supports this move. Again, it believes that the main line, of course, is objectively best, but white still is given a decent advantage by Stockfish with these d3 lines. And again, for the sake of saving so much theory and the headache attached to all of those main lines, I think this is well worth the investment. I'll talk about this, I think, a little bit more in the coming videos in this series once we reach these chapters. So just to put an end to this note, I want to finish by just mentioning one more thing. If I were to instead recommend and cover the main line in this masterclass, the masterclass could easily be 20 videos. By playing these d3 lines, I get to cover the main lines by Black, the most common options that you're going to see, which is a6, bishop a4, and the knight f6, or the immediate knight f6. I get to cover both of these lines in just 2 videos, which is an insane achievement because, again, we're not sacrificing much objective value, and in terms of the plans and ideas, it's a one-to-one map. All right, now let's go and look at what each video will entail. Let's cover all of the chapters that this masterclass will contain. So the first 7 videos are sidelines that Black can play at you. The last 2 videos in this series are going to constitute the main lines. Now, what is the big difference between the sidelines and the main lines? How does this map onto the actual board? Well, the way to remember this is that the sidelines are all of the options that Black has if they delay moving the knight out of f6. And that means if they first move the bishop, or first move the pawn, or first move the pawn on g6, or if they first play f5, or if they in fact move the knight to e7 instead of f6. Essentially, if they delay moving the knight to f6, those will be all of the sidelines. The main lines, therefore, are the variations where they quickly move the knight to f6 and only afterwards make a decision about this bishop, either moving it to c5 or moving it to e7. Now, on top of that, the added layer of complexity occurs by the fact that they can also throw in the move a6 and potentially b5 at their leisure, so whenever they want. And this doesn't change what I've just said. So essentially, if they play a6 here, they still have those same choices. If they delay the knight with bishop c5 or d6 or f5, the delayed Schliemann, or g6, the delayed Smyslov, or knight to e7, the delayed Kozio variation, those are all still the sidelines. But if they play a6 and then move the knight out, and again then and only then make a decision about their bishop either coming to c5 or e7, those are still the main lines. And this goes one step even further if they play b5 here, and then they have that split again between the sidelines and the main line. So if they now move their bishop out, or play g6, or f5, or d6, or knight to e7, all of those are still sidelines. But if they play knight f6 here, and then they move their bishop to c5 or to e7, those are the main lines. So I hope that that distinction there makes sense. It all depends on whether or not they first develop the knight and then make a decision about the f8 bishop. So with that out of the way, let's begin talking a little bit about the different variations. I will mention actually one more thing very quickly. The difference between them throwing in a6 and b5 and them not throwing in, especially in the sidelines, there isn't that big of a difference. There isn't much independent value. And what that means is that, for example, in the first chapter, we're looking at the sideline where they first develop the bishop to c5. We're also going to look at the sideline where they play a6 and then bishop c5, and also the sideline where they play a6, b5, and then bishop c5, right? So we're going to look at all of those sidelines in one video because they're very similar and there isn't much independent value. But there is one exception to that, which is the move d6. When they play d6, they can either play it here or they can play the so-called deferred Steinitz, which is a6 and then d6. Here there is a distinction, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I just want to mention here I do break it into two different videos, but aside from that, all of the other variations, if I'm looking at f5 or g6 or knight e7, I am also going to cover the delayed or the deferred version of them with them playing a6 and potentially b5. I'm also going to cover that in those videos. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's a little confusing. Rewatch that segment if you need to, but that's basically the big breakdown. Now let's go chapter by chapter. So chapter 1, like I said, is covering the so-called classical, which is bishop to c5 on move 3, or them playing a6 and or b5 and then bishop c5. Now, against this, we are going to play c3. The bishop on c5, the point is that it sits very strongly on c5. It's very ambitiously hitting f2, but the downside is it is also very targetable. It sits out there just asking to be hit with d4, so we are going to oblige. We're playing c3, and d4 is coming next. This is chapter number 1. Chapter number 2 covers the so-called Steinitz variation, which is the move d6 here. We are again going to look at their sideline, and we are going to respond in the most ambitious and direct way possible. We are playing d4. Especially important to play d4 here because they have played a very passive move d6, so we want to grab our chance to grab the initiative, to grab some space. Now, chapter number 3, like I said, this is the one exception. This is the deferred Steinitz, so them playing a6 and then d6. Now, the reason that I have to break this out into two videos is because I'd love to play d4 here and claim that there's no independent value and it essentially transposes, but this is already a big mistake because they have b5 and then they can take. And there's this common trap here, the so-called Noah's Ark trap, and unfortunately they already win a piece very early on. So this would be tragic, but we can avoid this by playing c3 and then insisting on d4 on the next move. So it is quite similar. There are shared themes, but because it is not an exact one-to-one map, we are going to split this up into 2 videos. There is some independent value, so that will be video 3. Video number 4 will be the fianchetto variation, also known as the Smyslov, which is playing the move g6 here. Again, we're also going to look at a6 and then g6. The idea here is quite interesting. Black often is going for this developing scheme with the bishop on g7 and the knight on e7. Now, with this developing scheme, we need to adapt a little bit, but largely we're going for the same sort of idea that we've already looked at against the other sidelines, and that means we are going for a quick d4 pawn push. But the other benefit is that because g6 often means that the knight comes to e7, and the reason for this is that often they want to be breaking with f5, this tends to be a more harmonious setup. When you play g6, bishop g7, it's very typical to put the knight on e7. So because they're putting the knight on e7, this means that when we move on to chapter 5, which is the Cosio defense, and the reason I've put these chapters right next to each other, this g6 and this knight e7, is because there's actually a lot of transpositional value and possibilities between these two lines, largely because after they play knight e7, they very much often follow that up with g6 and bishop g7. So there's a lot of transpositional value. I highlight that in very specific detail in the respective videos. So we're not going to sort of have to learn 2 completely different setups. We're going to aim to essentially transpose and only have to tackle one main setup. So those are chapters 4 and 5, the Smyslov and the Cosio with knight e7, and their respective deferred variations after a6 and then the Smyslov and then knight e7, the Cosio. Okay, chapter number 6 is the bird, which is the move knight to d4 here. This is a little bit dubious. You've already moved the knight. Are you really going to move it again? It is not very strong. I mean, obviously it is hitting our bishop. We are going to take this one off the map, and essentially we're just going to try to complete our development. These pawns actually aren't so strong, especially considering the fact that now this square on e5 doesn't have a pawn, so f4 becomes very possible and very strong, and a lot of times we get to generate some kingside play. So this bird defense, which is knight to d4, I have to mention it because it is actually surprisingly played more often than you would think, but it's not particularly strong. It's a little bit dubious, and we're going to be able to tackle it, I think, in very specific and I think very strong form. That's chapter number 6. The final sideline in chapter 7 is the Schliemann Gambit, which is f5. Now this move looks a little bit funny, and it also has a funny name attached to it, but we have to take it seriously because it can be very venomous, especially if you're not aware of it. So we don't take and allow them to push e4. Instead, we play knight c3 and simply defend our pawn. But this can get very sharp if black chooses to play these lines with d5, and you have to know what you're doing here as white if you're going to choose to play into these knight c3 lines. So unlike some of the other videos, which I think you can get away with just understanding the main ideas and themes, and you don't have to know the theory as heavily, and you don't have to memorize it as much, here you kind of just have to commit these lines to memory. I'll just show you. We're sacrificing a knight and then winning it back, and then queen g5 comes and queen. There's a lot of very specific moves that you have to know, and often only moves that you have to play. So unlike some of the other variations, commit this chapter to memory. Study the PGN that will be attached. It will be helpful for you. And you know, you'll be able to punish the Schliemann to the best that white can do it objectively. So those are the sidelines. The last 2 chapters, like I said, are looking at the main lines, and what that means, like I mentioned, is that they're playing knight f6 first, and they can play a6 or b5 if they'd like, but eventually they're committing the bishop only after playing knight to f6. Now, there's some added layers of complexity here because aside from them being able to choose to play a6 and then choose to play b5 or not, if they put the bishop on c5, and this is going to be chapter 8, they kind of have to do this after they make these early decisions with the pawns. That's okay. But if they want to put the bishop on e7, they can also first play d6 in these variations. But note that because the bishop can no longer jump to c5, this is still going to be in that bucket of them playing knight f6 first and later playing bishop e7, and it will just transpose. So that's going to be the final chapter, chapter number 9, that's going to be the video series covering the line where they play the bishop to e7, either by first playing d6 and then bishop e7, or immediately playing bishop e7 here. Now for the main lines, it might seem a little bit intimidating because there's all of these different move orders, but let me just simplify it a little bit. Think about it like this. Let's say they go for the most direct option. They go knight f6, we play d3, and here they either play the bishop to c5, or they play d6 and they play the bishop to e7. Respectively, that will be chapter 8 and chapter 9. Now, it might seem like, wait, are there differences if they play a6 and then b5 and then bishop c5? There are no differences, because we're playing c3 in all of these lines, and our moves are the same, and eventually, Black can hardly play the Ruy Lopez without going for this a6, b5 break. This is how they generate energy on the queen side. This is how they get good play going on that side of the board. The knight then comes to a5, they push even further. They can hardly play these structures without going for this queenside explosion, and therefore these lines are going to at some point transpose. So at some point they are going to play for a6. So for example, let's say they play d6 here. Let's say we castle, they castle, we can bring our rook to e1, but at some point they're going to play for this a6 and b5, and then we're just going to actually transpose to those earlier lines. So it might seem like a lot, but because of the transpositional values attached to all of these main lines, and for the sidelines, whether they go a6 or b5, it's actually very simple. Alright guys, thank you for watching this video. I know it was a lot. I mean, we talked about essentially an entire masterclass, and in the last couple of minutes we looked at the entire options that Black has. So I know it might seem overwhelming, but we're going to take it step by step. Each video will cover only one variation. You're going to slowly see how all of these map together and fit into place, and by the end of the series, you're going to be able to play the Ruy Lopez with complete confidence and with absolutely good objective play. Thank you for watching. I hope that you choose to join me on this journey. If you have any questions about what this masterclass is about, the philosophy behind how I chose my recommendations, anything of that sort, leave that comment down below and I will be happy to answer. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.